Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange has been called both a prequel and sequel to his acclaimed debut novel, They're There. That novel ends with a group of indigenous characters who converge at a powwow in modern-day Oakland, California. The new book traces generations of the family of Orville Redfeather, whom we met in the first book. The first part of Wandering Stars begins in Colorado, 1864, and includes historical details of the Sand Creek Massacre and the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Jude Starr is a survivor of the Sand Creek Massacre and is taken to the Fort Marion prison castle. He must learn English, learn to read the Bible, and learn to practice Christianity from Richard Henry Pratt, an evangelical prison guard who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was an institution that was used to attempt to eradicate Native history, language, culture, and identity. Wandering Stars is a novel about epigenetic and generational trauma. In the second part of the novel, the sequel portion to They're There, we see how characters in contemporary times must continue to battle those old, relentless, and insidious problems. This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. I spoke to Tommy Orange about his latest novel, Wandering Stars. Wandering Stars, this has been described as a prequel and a sequel to They're There, and we see how your characters are dealing with trauma from events that they endure and how that trauma is passed down. I feel like I wouldn't say that the novel is necessarily a historical fiction in that way that we think about historical fiction, but maybe that it's grounded in what we understand to be the real events, the facts of a particular time in American history. Where did the idea for the prequel part of this come from for you, since There was set in contemporary times, and then the second part of this new novel, Wandering Stars, is set in contemporary times? Where did this idea to have sort of out front the historical aspects come for you?
So I do appreciate you not categorizing it in historical fiction, because I never wanted to write historical fiction. And, nothing wrong with people who like it, read it, or write it. I just never wanted it for me. So this piece of history just kind of fell into my lap, or I fell into its lap. I don't know which one. I was writing a straightforward sequel that starts right after where the powwow ends in There, and was writing into it for about a year. And then I was in Sweden for the Swedish translation of There. They invited me to a museum, and I saw a newspaper clipping of Southern Cheyennes at St. Augustine, Florida, 1875. And I wondered why we were there, because I knew that we were never in Florida for any reason, not even near Florida. So I found out after doing research, this is where I guess fell down the kind of rabbit hole of information. I found out that this 3-year period where they were prisoners of war in St. Augustine, Florida, was the basis for which the entire boarding school system was created. And this was my tribe. Half of the prisoners of war were Southern Cheyennes. And so I just became fascinated with this piece of history and found a list of the prisoner names. And I'd already come up with the title Wandering Stars. And one of the prisoners' names was Star. And another one was Fairfield, which is a family from There. So it felt serendipitous or coincidental or like fate or something. And I knew that I was going to tie this family line somehow from these historical events to the present day and the aftermath from the first book.
And that happened all the way in Sweden. What was that moment like?
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, the whole museum curator context was weird, because they're sort of apologizing for having our stuff. They wanted to show me some Cheyenne stuff that they had through whatever means. They knew it was wrong, but they were like, do you want to see it? And so, just a reminder that colonization happened all over the world. It was a very surreal experience to be there, and then to realize while I was there that I was going to try to include this historical piece somehow into this very contemporary follow-up novel that I was working on. I had no idea how that was going to happen, but
Wow. I want to ask you some more about Jude Starr and the Stars and Bear Shield, but I want to tell you about something and just see what you think. I was reading the introduction that Tayari Jones wrote for this collection of stories, posthumously published story collection called Neighbors by
Yeah,
Diane.
I haven't I have that, but I haven't started it yet.
Well, so Diane Oliver died in uh, 1966. She was only 22, 23 years old. It was a motorcycle accident. In her stories, she explores the changing America, right? And she documents the culture of Black Americans living in the South in these pretty wide-ranging stories. It's like 14 short stories. But Tayari Jones wrote what she describes as advice from a peer. And it's this, and I'll quote: Imagine that the world as we know it is over. Now imagine the people of the future trying to sort out the wreckage. Well, that's what books are for, to let the new people know what the hell happened. That's the end of the quote. And then she goes on to describe how the discovery of someone like Oliver is like being able to sort through this time capsule. So I was, when I read things at the same time, I kind of start to conflate them. But in reading your book, I kept thinking about this idea that what occurred in the long past still finds its way through because of the existence of that same sort of documentation, right? Documents, that ephemera, the page on Charles Starr's typewriter. I mean, letters, pages, books, boxes left behind and passed along. And I kept thinking about what an important idea this is in Wandering Stars. Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, just like laying this quote on you, but what do you think about this idea of reading and writing?
I love the quote, and I have several times when characters in Wandering Stars talk about their world ending, and it's almost like there's a there's an invisible baton of story that's being passed down the generations that just barely gets passed. And as we get into the future, there's this box that one of the characters finds, and these stories that and words that lasted generations end up helping her. And I think writing and storytelling can serve many purposes. One of them is a personal one or a familial one, is about remembering who did what in order that we might live as a way of honoring the ancestors. But I also think in a more public way, and I have a book that is getting a lot of attention. It's just going to be number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. I just found out yesterday.
Oh, gosh.
I think the list comes out tomorrow. So there is a public piece. There's an audience piece this time around, and I do think as a country we have done a lot of looking back in a false way, in a sterilized way, in order to breed patriotic citizens or try to construct a narrative that doesn't cause anybody discomfort or shame, but at the expense of silencing a lot of stories and the harm of other citizens, other, like Native people who are citizens of this country and are Americans as well, at our peril. A lot of this history that's not looked at for the sake of keeping America sort of pure or innocent or proud. It's at our expense.
Yeah.
And also, the soul of America is at the heart of it too. People willfully being ignorant about actual historic facts that have to do with the foundation of the country. That's not good for anybody. That's not a healthy nation.
I was really drawn to the character of, well, we come to know him as Jude Starr, and the imprint that he leaves. I mean, for the duration of the novel is so profound for me. And part of the reason is, I guess, what we get from Charles and then everyone who comes after. I like this idea about the long ago past, that it can touch us and reach us. And Jude likes to read, and Charles is a writer. And this isn't, this kind of, oh, it's so such a point of fantasy in this novel, in this story, and it's so far removed from reality that Jude would love to read, and Charles was a writer. And I was thinking about the sort of Christianizing that was happening had this very interesting effect on Jude in that the Bible helps him learn to read and write, even though he doesn't speak. And he also learns English from Bear Shield, but he immerses himself in the Bible perhaps more as like a book, full of stories. And he likes, you wrote, I think it was the book of Psalms and Proverbs, and he finds, I think you said solace in Job and comfort from the book of Isaiah. And he aligns Jesus with a chief, a medicine man that leads with the heart and shares and all these connections, right? The Cheyenne prophet, sweet medicine, had been born of virgin birth, right? And then in Revelations, he finds this quote, raging waves of the sea foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, to whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. Jude says, I felt like I could spend my whole life reading, getting more and more understanding from words, from books. And I'd started to think of books as beings. So, Tommy Orange, for us bibliophiles out here, sorry, such a long, not even a question yet. These ideas, I mean, they bring forth emotion. You write your characters who love to read like someone for whom books are very important. And I've heard you discuss your own reading life starting not necessarily in school, but a little bit later. But I see in your books, and in this book in particular, just almost, it's not quite a motif, but it's like this recurring idea about, as you were talking about, the boxes and where memories are, and the storytelling and the books, and again the page in Charles's typewriter. But I wonder if you can talk about reading and how it is that reading makes its way into this book. You write about things that you're very passionate about, I feel like. So I'm wondering about what you can say about reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you were just quoting around the Bible and Jesus and, finding my way into writing about Christianity, it's connected to when I first started reading. I'll explain. Um, so I was raised evangelical Christian, and my dad was in the Native American church, and there's some of that in the first part of the book, the origins of the Native American church. But they both pray to Jesus, so it's either way, it's a Christian. There was a Christian household, and I was like, I grew up sort of afraid of the end of the world, and if I didn't accept Jesus into my heart, I was going to hell forever and ever. And that was a real thing that I thought about and was scared about. But I never became a Christian. There was a period in my childhood when I genuinely tried, and it just never happened for me. And I think I felt deeply scarred by this doom and gloom and fear mongering around the end of the world. And if you're not saved, then you're going to hell. So by the time I started reading after college, I got an undergrad in sound engineering, which we didn't read. We didn't have to read for that. It was all like hands-on technical work in studios. I was going at books first, like having had this hole made in me where my parents like taught me that the most important thing is your relationship to God. That was literally it wasn't like go to school, get good grades, get a good job. It was like, what is your relationship to God? That was the main thing. And for me to not go either of their ways, there still was this hole there. And so when I found fiction, I went at it with a kind of religious fervor. And so writing and reading took on this meaning that I needed to fill, and maybe continues to. I have a lot of passion for reading, and with Jude, I didn't want to attack Christianity because I had the experience I had, but I did want to be able to write about it. And I was able to write Jude experiencing Christianity as this sort of alien thing that was not a part of his experience. So often we just accept all of the Christian stuff like it's not weird. Another part of the book, one of the young characters talks about how he finds out that Native people used to worship the sun. And he's like, that actually makes more sense to worship the sun versus like this guy who died and rose from the grave like a zombie. Like that's weirder. And yet like Native people for worshiping the sun are sort of looked at like they're pagans or savages or something. So it was a way for me to write about something deeply personal to me and maybe process some things. And to really highlight how, you know, a lot of Native people had to encounter Christianity in ways that were kind of violent or, you know, forced, and they had to figure it out. And a lot of Native people are Christians or became Christians, and that can be okay too. So I wanted to write about it with complexity and compassion because it's a reality still. Still a lot of people who are Native and Christian, and that was passed down over generations as well.
I know you have a love of music, right? But besides this passion for reading that then we see with these characters, there's seems to be such an affinity for music in this book too, for instruments or for even the voice as an instrument. I just found that so interesting too. How does that go in your writing process? Are you somebody who needs stone silence, or are you sort of are we looking at characters who love music or the sound of a voice or the sound of something very lyrical because again this is something that you love? Is that when it emerges in the story?
Yeah, it's more it's more because I love it, and it, you know, you end up writing about the stuff that you love or that compels you. I've listened to music. It's not stone cold silence. I listen to music like 95% of the time that I'm writing, and the other 5% or 4%, I'm not listening to music because I'm reading out loud and I'm listening to myself read,
Hmm.
to hear the sound of the sentences in various stages of revision.
I wondered about that because the prosody in this novel is I maybe I think I could tell. It's just so gorgeous. And to read the book out loud, to read sections of it out loud, where there's repetition or there's a certain word or there's, yeah, I think somewhere in there I could tell that there was something going on with that.
I think getting my degree in sound engineering like
Huh.
rewired my brain to think about sound in a different way than I would have had I not like focused 2 years of my life like really thinking about the sound of sound and like learning frequencies and mixing. And I didn't realize till probably after I'd already written there that that this sonic aspect was a part of my revision process. I just knew that I needed to read out loud to understand where I was at, where a draft was at, how far along a sentence was.
Wow. Oh, that's so interesting to me. And do you find yourself like hearing certain things that you don't perceive when you're just reading in silence and then you go to make change? Is there a lot of revising or changing at that point?
Yeah, I mean, there's things that your eyes pick up that your ears might not, and vice versa. So I think it's, to me, it's a really important part of revision, and I think sometimes people forget that letters are phonetic symbols,
Yes.
and for more of the time, people have experienced listening to stories in human history
Yeah.
rather than this reading experience. So there's something I think primal too about the sonics of storytelling.
Also I'm thinking about how that changes depending on the point of view, right? So from chapter to chapter, we have these shifts in point of view, not just alternating narrators, but points of view like from third person to first to even second, which the second person, I think you're quite amazing at. Can you talk about this? Like when how and it's such a stupid question to ask. Like, how does that work when you decide what's third or what? It must be just a very particular kind of thing that you're doing with a character or at that juncture in the narrative when you decide what's second person or what's first. But it just works so effectively. I think, some people have told me, oh, when there are too many narrators or it throws me off, or I don't like second person point of view or that kind of thing. It's so effective in this novel that you're not even sort of thinking like, oh, here we go, second person. This one's going to be first person. You just sort of are so immersed that you don't even make those sort of conscious observations. But how does it work for you in the writing?
So it's a part of it's a revision tool for me. So it's a way to keep working. If I don't feel like working, I'll transpose, it's a musical term, POVs,
Mhm.
as a way to experiment with language and with distance, emotional distance from the character. Because present tense, first person is super immediate. Is that what this character needs? Is that where the reader should be oriented for where we are in the story as a whole? So I change tenses and I change POVs for all my characters until I find what's right. And it's a way because it's super tedious to do that. Nobody wants to do that kind of work, but often writing is grueling and you have to do it when you don't feel like it. It can't just be inspiration based. It's a discipline. So you have to find ways to keep working. And so that is one of the ways that I've found where if I'm stuck, I'm just, I'm gonna mess around with this POV and with this tense and see what it does. And usually it generates new language and I'll use sentences that weren't there before and I'll sort of trick myself into working.
I want to talk about this idea of freckles or other physical features that are a tell for characters, that they're not just one thing outwardly in terms of being, not just white or not just Native American. It seems to me an idea that, cuts across race and ethnicity. And this notion of identity, I mean, it can be so simple to be who you are, who we are, to be our identity, like that's our identity. And yet it seems to be made so much more complicated. And that's the story of identity in America for sure. And it has been, and it continues to be, and it causes so much strife. How an individual person identifies is not even the whole story, it seems. And as we see in Wandering Stars, it itself becomes such a source of conflict. So it's just this, ongoing thing from hearkening all the way back to the beginning of the novel as we see then into, the aftermath 2018 section. It just continues to be a problem, this idea. And I wonder how you consider this idea of what we generally call identity. I mean, in so many different contexts, we go to that word. And I wonder how you consider that idea with Wandering Stars.
I'm not sure if I should speak first to the freckles, but I think it was just part of your question.
Oh, sorry.
I am, and I'm a person who has a white mother and a Native father, and I'm a person who has freckles. And I grew up in Oakland, which is super diverse, and identity is like a major part of life because people come from all different backgrounds and look all different ways. I'm usually in like all white spaces. I'm not considered white, and then sometimes in spaces where it's all Native people, I might be considered white. So that's a really confusing. That puts you in a really confusing place where you don't feel like you belong anywhere. And yet I do feel like I belong in Oakland, just being in Oakland. I worked in the Fruitvale in Oakland for many years. There's a large Hispanic population there, and people would every time first speak to me in Spanish. So the identity is just something that I have lived with my whole life and will probably always be writing about. I'm working on my third book, and there's a heavy identity piece. I think some people who have the privilege of not thinking about identity think it's like this woke whatever that people are obsessed with because it has to do with whatever negative aspect of being woke they think they're talking about. But if you have never had to think about belonging, then that's a privilege that you need to look at. Like people who have conflicts around identity, it's a core thing. If one of these people who is annoyed by talking about identity, if something about their identity was shaken at its core, they would experience a crisis. It's just that a lot of people get to walk around like they own the place, like they don't ever need to look at they don't ever need to think about how they're perceived. And that's not the Native experience. We're constantly sort of being qualified and judged from the outside. And then in schools, all they teach about Native people is how it relates to pilgrims 400 years ago. It's this insane like picture that we have to work with other Americans around how little they actually know about us.
In the earlier parts of the book, characters don't have words for, these kinds of things or even what's happening to them. I mean, I think Jude himself says early in the book something like, most things I don't understand, I have to accept, or most things I didn't understand, I had to accept. And in the second part of the book, in the contemporary times, when we do have words for things and diagnoses and therapy and rehab, we know that having the words, the knowledge of things is only part of a much more complex thing. That's still something of a bridge too far for so many people. So you know the word, but so what? And now what are you going to do? But later in the novel, Orville says not that he had to accept what he didn't understand, as his forebears had to, but that he wanted to feel the world. And he says, and not simply become obedient to the cold demands of a cruel world. And he's talking about addiction there. But I saw it as such a kind of an idea, of an echo of what Jude had said, but turned on its head. So maybe it's the other side of what Jude had said. Most things I don't understand, I had to accept, versus I don't want to simply become obedient to the cold demands of a cruel world. And talking about addiction. But so thinking about this idea of how Jude couldn't speak, but he had such profound knowledge of things and understanding and curiosity, and was so watchful and super observant. And then you have Orville, who's in a different time where we have, the luxury of knowing things, of knowing a little bit more. And then where are we? So I just wonder how we can consider this idea of when we have the words for something. Your book is sort of pointing to this idea of what we can do for ourselves sometimes, what we can do when we have support, but what we can also do for ourselves if we have the ability, I think, to sort of look around and know what we want. And that's not easy for everybody. That is a bridge too far for some people. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were drafts of Wandering Stars where I was thinking on the page even more about language, and my editor kind of had me pare it down a little bit. But I think a lot about language. Obviously, I'm a writer, and I think what Orville is getting at related to addiction is that a lot of people think that drugs are about numbing pain, but what Orville finds in them that first draws him to them is that he feels stuff that he had already numbed a long time ago. He's feeling stuff for the first time that he didn't have access to. And I think language and finding clarity through language can really do that same work, can put you back in touch with things that you have shut yourself off from. So I think, Orville's not necessarily interested in language, but I think I'm working around this idea of feeling and not feeling trauma, and how the past affects the present, and what do we do about that, to how do we make ourselves feel better. These are all things that I'm trying to draw compassion for this thing called addiction that affects so many people. And there's an innocence at a lot of the beginnings of addictions that have to do with wanting to feel something, or wanting to be able to be yourself, but you're too uncomfortable to be, or wanting to feel better because you don't feel good. That's different than numbing, just going numb. That's a very like boring and static picture, and an unsympathetic one for somebody to just numb out. That already makes you kind of dislike them or are bored with them. But people who are desperate to feel because they've already been numb, that's a different picture than how we usually talk about addicts.
You were writing this novel during the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
I've interviewed a few authors recently who, called their 2024 publication their pandemic book, right? That they were really really in the throes of it during, 2020, 2021. And some of them have talked about the silver lining, how great it was, how great it was to have that time to give to their work. And some have said, oh, the pandemic it wasn't any different. I was always alone and shut away and working on things. But what I was trying to think about how, I think about the Spanish flu in the novel and the characters that wear masks, right? Like Charles is wearing a mask at one time. And then I was thinking about like the pandemic just in terms of all of the things that we read about and how the pandemic affected young people, is still affecting young people. And I know you're a dad. So I was trying to consider the ways that you think about our world right now, how we came through the pandemic. What a nightmare it was at the beginning, really, when we didn't even know what was going on or what the protocols were. You could only buy masks for $10, in the drugstore, $10 for one. Um, It was just, it was just a very bleak time. And I was thinking about how all of our young people who are already so put upon in this world in 2020 and 2021, and how we've come through it up to this point, and we sort of look up and it's 2024 and we see what's happening in our world, and marginalized people and people who are already put upon. I wonder if you think about, as a father, what we can do just in terms of, not to be too corny about it, but in terms of the arts. You're a writer, in terms of the things that you do, in terms of the things that They're There is already a classic. I mean, the way that They're There has done so much for so many. We're in 2024, a very strange country, and we've come through so many things. I think I have an answer, but I wonder what you think the work of the writer can do for young people at a time like this.
Well, the pandemic, just to quickly note, the pandemic was not good for me. There were like sweet moments of being together with family. There were pockets, but overall, it was a time of anxiety and losing structure, and there was a lot of bad things. And
Yes.
I think a lot of us are annoyed at the writers who were prolific and put out like really chunky books right after the pandemic ended. But I think these stories, like understanding the context of these decades of boarding schools that we went through, that Native people went through, that this country put us through. I think America taking a harder look at itself in the past and in the present is the only way this country is going to survive itself. And so we're facing a 2024 election year, and our choices are like pathetic. But I don't know that Wandering Stars is going to do any of that. I do know it's telling a story that a lot of Americans need to hear, and I hope people are receptive to that.
Tommy Orange, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. What a thrill and what an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your super nice and deep questions. This was a great interview. Thank you.
Tommy Orange is the author of Wandering Stars. He's a graduate of the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts, an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California. His first book, They're There, was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize and received the 2019 American Book Award. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Thanks for listening. You can write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.